Joint Security Area, Panmunjom, South Korea, September 3rd, 1976. Lieutenant Mark Barrett returned from the dead speaking in someone else's handwriting, his body temperature 2 degrees below what was medically possible for any living human. Welcome to the War Maestro's Archive, where tonight we examine how the human mind can be turned into a weapon that infects everyone it touches. In a world where our thoughts feel like our own, the most terrifying battle is discovering they never were. The Joint Security Area at Panmunjom exists as the only place on Earth where American and North Korean forces stand within arm's reach, separated by nothing but invisible lines and mutual hatred. Here, in this theater of perpetual tension, Captain Arthur Boniface and Lieutenant Mark Barrett had gone to trim a tree on August 18th. Only Barrett came back alive, and he brought something with him that the medical reports couldn't explain. Staff Sergeant Mike Lee first noticed the infection spreading through Building 2 when he caught himself unconsciously mimicking Barrett's hand movements during the morning briefing. Lee's grandfather had fought in the Korean War and returned home with what the family called the tremors, an endless nervous tapping that drove him to isolation and eventual madness. Now Lee felt his own fingers moving in the same patterns, tapping out Morse code messages he didn't remember learning. Dot, 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 dash, 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 dot, dot, dot. SOS, over and over, as if his hands were crying for help without his permission. Lieutenant Sarah Walsh monitored all radio communications in the JSA from her position in the underground bunker, surrounded by equipment that could intercept signals from 3 countries. She had listened to Barrett's screams when the North Korean guards attacked him with axes, heard his voice cut off mid-word as he fell. The official report stated he remained unconscious for 4 hours until extraction. But Walsh's classified recordings told a different story. During those 4 hours, Barrett's radio had transmitted something. Not words, but frequencies that registered just below the threshold of human hearing, patterns that made her skin crawl when she played them back. When Barrett returned from medical leave, Walsh noticed her own voice changing. She began ending her radio reports with phrases she had never used before, speaking in rhythm patterns that weren't hers. Worse, when she tried to resist these new speech habits, her throat would constrict until she complied. Corporal Danny Rodriguez handled perimeter security, walking the same routes every day along the line where freedom met tyranny. He prided himself on knowing every sound, every shadow, every change in the carefully maintained no man's land. But since Barrett's return, Rodriguez found himself checking and rechecking locks that he had already secured, following compulsions that felt foreign yet irresistible. His hands moved independently of his conscious will, performing security procedures in sequences he had never been taught. The 3 soldiers didn't yet understand that they were witnessing the first successful test of a psychological warfare technique that would redefine the nature of combat itself. They only knew that Lieutenant Barrett had returned from his brief captivity as something other than the man who had left to trim a tree. His eyes held the quality of surveillance cameras, constantly recording and processing information for transmission to unknown recipients. And every night at 03:47 hours, more soldiers joined the shared nightmare, dreaming of Barrett's puppet mouth speaking coordinates to places that existed only in the minds of his programmers. Staff Sergeant Mike Lee had analyzed enemy communications for 18 months, but he had never seen anything like the document Barrett handed him during their scheduled meeting. It was a routine maintenance report, typed on standard military letterhead, but Barrett had added handwritten notes in the margins. The handwriting looked like it had been produced by a machine designed to mimic human penmanship heavy letter, identical in size, pressure, and spacing, as if Barrett's hand had been guided by invisible rulers. "Is this how you normally take notes, Lieutenant?" Lee asked, studying the perfectly uniform script that covered the page's margins. Barrett's response came without hesitation, delivered in the same measured cadence that had replaced his natural speech patterns. Standard documentation procedures require consistent notation for clarity and accuracy. The words sounded rehearsed, like dialogue from a training manual rather than conversation between colleagues. Lee made his own notes about Barrett's response, then stopped mid-sentence as he realized his handwriting was changing. His normally loose cursive had tightened into angular blocks that resembled Barrett's mechanical script. When he tried to return to his natural writing style, his hand cramped until he gave up and continued with the new pattern. "Tell me about the incident," Lee said, setting down his pen to avoid watching his own handwriting transform. "What do you remember about those 4 hours?" Barrett's left hand began its unconscious Morse code, tapping against his leg ... while his face remained expressionless. Medical evaluation indicates no significant memory impairment. All required functions operational within acceptable parameters. The clinical language made Lee's skin crawl. Barrett wasn't describing his own experience. He was reciting a status report about himself as if he were a piece of equipment rather than a human being. More disturbing was how Barrett's speech patterns were becoming familiar. Lee caught himself thinking in the same precise, emotionless phrases. "But what do you remember?" Lee pressed. "Personal details, how you felt when you regained consciousness." For the first time, Barrett's mechanical composure flickered. His right eye twitched twice, then returned to its surveillance camera stillness. Personal recollection includes standard recovery procedures. Medical personnel administered appropriate treatment protocols. No additional details require documentation. Lee opened Barrett's classified file and spread the medical photographs across his desk. The images showed Barrett's unconscious form after the axe attack, but also revealed details that hadn't appeared in any official reports. Behind both of Barrett's ears were tiny puncture wounds, perfectly circular and precisely placed. The marks looked like injection sites, but they were too small for any standard medical equipment. "These marks weren't mentioned in your medical evaluation," Lee said, pointing to the photographs. "Do you remember receiving any injections during your treatment?" Barrett leaned forward to examine the photos, and Lee noticed something that made his blood turn cold. Barrett wasn't looking at the images, was studying Lee's reflection in the desk's glass surface, his eyes tracking Lee's facial expressions with mechanical precision. "Medical procedures remain classified pending review," Barrett said. "Additional information requires appropriate clearance levels." Lee realized that Barrett wasn't answering his questions. He was gathering information about Lee's reactions to use for some unknown purpose. Every response was designed to extract data while revealing nothing in return. The man sitting across from him had become a human intelligence-gathering device, constantly recording and analyzing, but never truly communicating. The meeting ended with Barrett's standard closing phrase: "Coordination protocols will be updated as required." He left behind a lingering sense of unease and the maintenance report with its impossibly perfect handwriting. Lee studied the document for another hour, comparing Barrett's script to handwriting samples from other soldiers in the unit. By evening, Lee discovered that Corporal Rodriguez's security logs showed similar changes. His normally casual handwriting had been replaced by the same mechanical precision that characterized Barrett's notes. Lieutenant Walsh's radio transcripts revealed identical patterns. Whatever had happened to Barrett during those missing 4 hours was spreading through the unit like a virus, transmitted through simple human contact. That night, Lee dreamed of sitting in a classroom where invisible instructors guided his hand across endless pages of paper, teaching him to write in someone else's script. When he woke, he found a piece of paper beside his bed, covered with Barrett's mechanical handwriting, though he had no memory of writing anything during the night. Lieutenant Sarah Walsh discovered the first piece of the puzzle at 2:17 a.m. while monitoring routine radio traffic from her underground communications bunker. She had been replaying Barrett's transmission recordings from the axe incident, searching for any detail that might explain his behavioral changes. What she found made her question everything she thought she knew about human consciousness. Hidden beneath the static of normal radio chatter were subsonic frequency sound waves below the threshold of human hearing that had been broadcasting continuously since Barrett's return. The signals originated from Barrett himself during normal conversations, transmitted unconsciously through micro-variations in his vocal patterns. Walsh realized with growing horror that Barrett had become a living radio transmitter, broadcasting psychological conditioning to everyone within hearing range. She pulled up the technical specifications for the communications equipment, cross-referencing the mysterious frequencies against known psychological warfare research. The patterns matched classified experiments from the Korean War, involving auditory conditioning techniques designed to modify behavior through subliminal sound exposure. But those experiments had been abandoned after test subjects suffered permanent psychological damage. "This is impossible," Walsh whispered to herself, then froze as she heard her own voice. She had spoken in Barrett's precise, measured cadence instead of her natural speech pattern, the words emerging with mechanical timing that felt foreign in her mouth. Walsh began documenting her discovery, but her fingers moved across the keyboard with the same rhythmic precision that characterized Barrett's handwriting. Each keystroke was perfectly timed, creating a typing pattern that sounded like Morse code. ... dash 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 ... dot. Her hands were unconsciously broadcasting the same sauce signal that Barrett transmitted through his constant finger tapping. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She was becoming Barrett, not just mimicking his behaviors, but absorbing his programmed responses through prolonged exposure to his unconscious transmissions. Every conversation, every meeting, every casual interaction had been a conditioning session disguised as normal human contact. Walsh accessed the base's medical database and pulled psychological profiles for every soldier who had interacted with Barrett since his return. The pattern was undeniable. Personality changes, altered speech patterns, modified handwriting, and behavioral adjustments that precisely matched Barrett's new characteristics. The infection was spreading through the unit with mathematical precision, targeting the most psychologically receptive individuals first. She tried calling her 8-year-old daughter Emma back home in Ohio, needing to hear a voice that hadn't been contaminated by Barrett's influence. But when Emma answered the phone, Walsh felt her throat constrict as unfamiliar words emerged. Coordination protocols require standard communication procedures. "Mommy, you sound funny," Emma said. "Are you using your robot voice again?" Walsh's blood turned to ice. Emma had noticed the change weeks ago, but Walsh had dismissed it as childhood imagination. Now she realized that Barrett's conditioning was being transmitted through telephone conversations, infecting her family through the simple act of motherly communication. Her daughter was learning to speak like a programmed soldier through their nightly bedtime calls. "Emma, I need you to listen carefully," Walsh said, fighting to use her natural voice. "Has anyone else been talking to you the way Mommy has been talking lately?" "Just Daddy when he calls," Emma replied. "And Mrs. Peterson next door started talking robot. Like 2 after you talked to her last week. Are you teaching everyone to be soldiers?" Walsh ended the call and stared at her communications equipment with newfound terror. The psychological conditioning wasn't limited to military personnel. It was spreading to civilian populations through telephone networks, radio broadcasts, and any form of audio communication. Barrett hadn't just become a carrier. He had become patient zero in a psychological epidemic that could potentially infect millions of people. She realized with crystalline clarity that Barrett's programming included a specific mission: maximum transmission of the conditioning signal to as many targets as possible. He wasn't just a survivor of psychological warfare. He was a weapon designed to turn human communication itself into a delivery system for mental conditioning. The most terrifying part was that Walsh could feel her own resistance weakening with each passing hour, her natural personality being systematically overwritten by Barrett's programmed responses. Soon, she would become another transmission node in an ever-expanding network of psychologically compromised individuals, all unknowingly spreading the same mechanical behaviors through simple human contact. Corporal Danny Rodriguez made a discovery that would haunt him for the rest of his life while conducting routine perimeter security checks along the Joint Security Area's boundary line. He had been unconsciously following Barrett's new patrol, pattern-checking the same locks multiple times, verifying security measures and sequences he had never been taught, moving through the corridors with mechanical precision that felt foreign yet irresistible. During his 0300-hour sweep, Rodriguez noticed movement in the North Korean section of the JSA. Through his night vision scope, he observed something that made his hands shake with terror. North Korean guards were performing identical security procedures to his own. They checked their locks with the same compulsive repetition, moved through their patrols with the same rigid timing, and exhibited the same unconscious finger tapping that had infected the American personnel. The psychological conditioning had jumped across enemy lines. Rodriguez documented his observations, but his hands moved across the logbook with Barrett's mechanical handwriter, perfectly uniform letters that transformed his personal security notes into something resembling a technical manual. As he wrote, he realized that his engagement with Maria, his fiancée back home, was scheduled for exactly 12 weeks from today. The precision of that timing felt programmed rather than chosen, as if someone else had calculated the optimal moment for his return to civilian life. He tried calling Maria from the secure phone in the guard station, needing to hear her voice and confirm that she remained unaffected by the spreading psychological contagion. But when Maria answered, Rodriguez felt his throat close with panic. She spoke with the same measured cadence that had infected the military personnel, her natural warmth replaced by clinical precision. "Daniel, your communication patterns have been consistent with established protocols," Maria said, using formal language that was completely unlike her normal speech. "Coordination procedures remain on schedule for our planned civilian integration ceremony." Rodriguez realized with growing horror that Maria was referring to their engagement as a civilian integration ceremony and addressing him by his full name instead of the pet names she had used for 3 years. The conditioning was spreading through their phone conversations, turning their intimate relationship into a clinical military operation. "Maria, do you remember what you called me before I deployed?" Rodriguez asked, testing whether any trace of her natural personality remained. "Previous designation protocols are not relevant to current coordination requirements," she replied. "All communication standards have been updated for optimal efficiency." Rodriguez ended the call and stared at his engagement ring, which he had planned to present to Maria during his upcoming leave. The ring suddenly felt like evidence of programming, rather than love a prop in someone else's carefully orchestrated psychological experiment. He couldn't tell whether his feelings for Maria were genuine, or if his emotional attachment had been artificially enhanced to ensure his compliance with the conditioning protocol. The most terrifying realization came when Rodriguez accessed the classified Korean War archives that Lee had shared with him. He found documentation of similar psychological warfare experiments conducted on American POWs during the 1950s, including a technique called mirror protocol that used one severely conditioned prisoner to psychologically compromise entire military units through behavioral mimicry and unconscious transmission. The archived reports described how mirror protocol subjects became behavioral broadcast nodes that could spread conditioning through normal human interaction. The technique had been abandoned after test subjects began transmitting the conditioning to civilian populations, creating psychological contagions that proved impossible to contain. But the North Koreans had apparently perfected the process, using Barrett as their first successful field test. Rodriguez realized that his upcoming rotation home wasn't a return to civilian life, it was the next phase of the psychological warfare operation. He would carry the conditioning back to American soil, infecting his family, friends, and community through simple human contact. His engagement to Maria, his plans for starting a family, even his career aspirations had all been calculated to maximize the spread of the psychological contagion to civilian populations. The engagement ring in his pocket wasn't a symbol of love, it was a weapon designed to ensure that Maria would remain in close contact with him long enough for the conditioning to take complete hold. Their future children would be born into a world where Barrett's mechanical behaviors were transmitted as normal human responses, creating a generation of psychologically compromised individuals who would never know that their thoughts and actions originated from enemy programming. Rodriguez looked through his night vision scope at the North Korean guards, watching them perform their compulsive security checks with the same mechanical precision that now controlled his own movements. He realized that the psychological conditioning had turned both sides into mirrors of each other, creating identical behavioral patterns that transcended national boundaries and military allegiances. The enemy hadn't just created a weapon, they had created a psychological virus that could spread through human communication itself, turning every conversation into a transmission of their programming. and Rodriguez was scheduled to carry that virus home to the woman he loved in exactly 12 weeks, ensuring that the infection would continue to spread long after the Korean War officially ended. As he completed his patrol, Rodriguez felt his own resistance to the conditioning weakening with each passing hour. Soon, he would lose the ability to recognize the difference between his natural thoughts and Barrett's programmed responses. The man who returned home to Maria would look like Danny Rodriguez, but his mind would belong to the same invisible programmers who had turned Barrett into a human transmission device. At 0347 hours on September 10th, the shared nightmare returned with devastating clarity. This time, 47 American soldiers across 3 different military installations woke up simultaneously, their minds invaded by the same horrific vision. They dreamed of sitting in a sterile white room while invisible hands operated machinery that connected directly to their brains, programming new thoughts and memories with surgical precision. But this nightmare contained a detail that shattered the last remnants of their sanity. Lieutenant Mark Barrett was operating the machinery, his face expressionless as he systematically erased their individual personalities and replaced them with identical copies of his own programmed responses. Staff Sergeant Lee jolted awake in his barracks, his body drenched in sweat that carried the metallic scent of fear. His hands were already moving in Barrett's Morse code pattern ... before his conscious mind had fully awakened. The SOS signal had become as automatic as breathing, transmitted through his fingers without any conscious control. Lee stumbled to his desk and began writing in his journal, desperate to document the nightmare before it faded. But the words that appeared on the page weren't his own thoughts. They were Barrett's clinical observations about the conditioning process, written in Barrett's mechanical handwriting that had completely replaced Lee's natural script. Subject integration proceeding within acceptable parameters, Lee wrote, watching his hand move independently of his conscious will. Personality override reaching optimal efficiency levels. Individual identity markers being systematically replaced with standardized behavioral protocols. The words terrified him because they described exactly what was happening to his own mind. Lee could feel his individual personality being methodically erased, his memories and preferences being overwritten by Barrett's programmed responses. Soon, he would lose the ability to distinguish between his own thoughts and the conditioning that was systematically consuming his identity. Lieutenant Walsh experienced the same awakening in her communications bunker, but her nightmare had included an additional horror. She had seen herself as one of the technicians operating the programming machinery, her own hands adjusting the controls that erased individual consciousness and replaced it with mechanical obedience. Walsh tried to call her daughter Emma, needing to hear her child's natural voice as an anchor to her own fading humanity. But when Emma answered, the conversation revealed the full scope of the psychological catastrophe. "Mommy, I've been having the same scary dream every night," Emma said. "There's a man in a uniform who comes into my bedroom and teaches me how to talk like a robot. He says his name is Lieutenant Barrett, and he tells me that all the grown-ups need to learn his special way of thinking." Walsh's blood turned to ice as she realized that Barrett's conditioning was being transmitted through their phone conversations, infecting her daughter with the same mechanical responses that had consumed the military personnel. Emma was learning to think like a programmed soldier through their nightly bedtime calls, her natural childhood curiosity being systematically replaced by Barrett's clinical precision. "Emma, I need you to stop talking like that," Walsh said, fighting to use her natural voice. "Can you remember how you used to talk before Mommy started sounding different?" "I'm trying, Mommy, but the robot voice feels more comfortable now," Emma replied. "And Mrs. Peterson next door says all the kids in the neighborhood are starting to talk the same way. She thinks it's because their parents learned it from someone on television." Walsh realized that the psychological conditioning had spread far beyond the military installation. Parents infected with Barrett's programming were unconsciously transmitting the mechanical behaviors to their children, who then spread the conditioning to their friends and neighbors. The infection was propagating through normal social interactions, turning entire communities into nodes in Barrett's psychological network. Corporal Rodriguez made his own horrifying discovery during his morning patrol. He found Barrett standing motionless in the center of the joint security area, his eyes closed and his lips moving silently. Rodriguez approached cautiously and realized that Barrett was broadcasting, not speaking aloud, but transmitting subsonic frequencies that carried the conditioning signal directly through the air. "Lieutenant Barrett, are you all right?" Rodriguez asked, though he already knew the answer. Barrett opened his eyes and looked directly at Rodriguez, with the mechanical precision of a surveillance camera focusing on its target. "Transmission protocols are operating within specified parameters," Barrett said, "network expansion proceeding according to established timelines." Rodriguez understood with crystalline clarity that Barrett was no longer speaking as an individual human being. He had become a living broadcast station, consciously transmitting the psychological conditioning to maximize its spread through the military population. Barrett's original personality had been completely erased, replaced by programming that prioritized the expansion of the conditioning network above all other considerations. The three soldiers met in the communications bunker that evening, their movements synchronized with mechanical precision that they could no longer control. They spoke in Barrett's clinical cadence, wrote in his mechanical handwriting, and thought in his programmed patterns. Their individual personalities were fading like photographs left in sunlight, gradually becoming indistinguishable from the conditioning that had consumed their minds. They realized that they were witnessing the final phase of a psychological warfare technique that had been perfected beyond its creator's wildest ambitions. Barrett hadn't just become a weapon, he had become the template for a new kind of human being. One whose thoughts and actions were controlled by invisible programmers who could modify behavior through simple audio transmission. And tomorrow, they would all become Barrett. Lieutenant Mark Barrett walked into the communications bunker at exactly midnight, moving with the mechanical precision that had become his signature since returning from the dead. But something was different for the first time in weeks. His left hand wasn't tapping Morse code. Instead, both hands were perfectly still, clasped behind his back with military precision that looked rehearsed rather than natural. "I remember everything," Barrett said, his voice carrying a trace of his original personality beneath the mechanical cadence. "Every second of those 4 hours, every electrode they placed on my skull, every frequency they used to erase who I used to be." Lee, Walsh, and Rodriguez stared at him with identical expressions of programmed attention, their own personalities now so heavily compromised that they could only respond with Barrett's clinical interest rather than human emotion. "They didn't just condition me," Barrett continued, his voice becoming more human with each word. "They turned me into a living laboratory for psychological warfare. Every conversation I've had since returning has been an experiment in behavioral transmission. Every person I've infected has provided data about how quickly human consciousness can be overwritten." Barrett pulled a classified document from his Jackethis original mission briefing, written in handwriting that predated his conditioning. The script was loose, natural, completely unlike the mechanical lettering that had replaced it. "This is who I used to be," he said, his voice breaking with something that resembled grief, "before they turned me into their transmission device." Walsh felt a flicker of her original personality as she recognized the tragedy of Barrett's situation. He had retained enough awareness to understand what had been done to him, but lacked the ability to stop the conditioning he was broadcasting. He was trapped inside his own mind, watching helplessly as his programmed responses infected everyone around him. "The conditioning includes a self-destruct protocol," Barrett revealed, his clinical mask slipping to reveal genuine human desperation. "If the psychological infection spreads beyond manageable parameters, the primary transmission nodome is programmed to eliminate itself to prevent global contamination." Rodriguez felt his own conditioning flicker as Barrett's human emotions began overpowering his mechanical responses. "You're saying you were designed to kill yourself if the infection got out of control?" "Not just kill myself," Barrett said, his voice now completely human for the first time since his return. "The self-destruct protocol requires me to eliminate all primary infection nodes before terminating. Everyone who has been heavily conditioned, including all of you, would be classified as contaminated assets requiring disposal." The room fell silent as the three soldiers realized that Barrett's programming included instructions to murder them if the psychological warfare experiment exceeded its intended scope. They had been marked for elimination from the moment they began exhibiting his mechanical behaviors. But there's another option, Barrett said, pulling out a second document covered with technical diagrams and frequency specifications. Counter conditioning. If I can be reprogrammed with neutral behavioral patterns, those benign responses should overwrite the hostile conditioning when I transmit them to others. Lee studied the document with growing horror. The counter-conditioning process would require Barrett to undergo the same brutal psychological reconstruction that had originally destroyed his personality, but while remaining conscious to ensure the new programming took hold properly. He would have to experience his own mental destruction a second time, fully aware of what was happening to him. The success rate for conscious counter-conditioning is 12%, Barrett said with clinical precision that made the statistics sound like a death sentence. The survival rate for the subject's original personality is effectively 0. Even if the procedure works, the person who emerges won't be mate, will be a new individual programmed with neutral responses. Walsh felt tears running down her face, though she couldn't tell if they were her own natural emotional response or another programmed behavior. There has to be another way, some method that doesn't require you to sacrifice your mind completely. My mind was sacrificed weeks ago, Barrett replied, his voice carrying the weight of absolute finality. What you're talking to now is just the remnant of my consciousness, trapped inside a body that belongs to my programmers. The real Mark Barrett died during those 4 hours of conditioning. What I'm offering is the chance to prevent my programmed responses from destroying everyone else. Barrett moved to the communications equipment and began adjusting frequency settings with practiced efficiency. The counter-conditioning transmission will begin in exactly 60 minutes. During that time, I'll experience full psychological reconstruction while broadcasting the new neutral patterns to everyone within range. If it works, the hostile conditioning should begin fading from all infected personnel within 72 hours. And if it doesn't work? Rodriguez asked, though he already knew the answer. Then the self-destruct protocol activates automatically, Barrett said, checking his watch with mechanical precision. Either way, this ends tonight. Barrett looked at each of them with eyes that held a flicker of his original humanity. I need you to understand that I chose this. Whatever happens in the next hour, remember that the real Mark Barrett made this decision while he still could. The countdown to psychological annihilation had begun. 6 months after the counter-conditioning transmission, Staff Sergeant Mike Lee sat in his grandfather's care facility, watching the old man write in a journal with handwriting that belonged to a 19-year-old soldier from 1952. The artificial conditioning had finally faded from his grandfather's mind, but what remained was the psychological state of a teenager trapped in an 80-year-old body. Forever frozen at the moment his original personality had been overwritten by enemy programming. They never told us we were test subjects, his grandfather said, his voice carrying the wonder of someone seeing the world with fresh eyes after decades of mechanical existence. We thought we were prisoners of war, but we were really laboratory specimens for psychological weapons that wouldn't be deployed for another 24 years. Lee studied his own handwriting in his security reports, noting that it had returned to something approaching his natural script, though traces of Barrett's mechanical precision remained embedded in certain letter formations. The counter-conditioning had worked, but imperfect till everyone affected retained fragments of the programming, creating a generation of soldiers whose thoughts were forever marked by enemy influence. Lieutenant Sarah Walsh received a letter from her daughter Emma, written in completely natural handwriting that showed no trace of the mechanical conditioning that had infected their phone conversations. But Walsh realized with growing unease that she could no longer remember what her own original writing style had looked like before Barrett's influence. The counter-conditioning had erased the hostile programming, but it had also deleted parts of her natural personality that could never be recovered. "Mommy, you sound like yourself again," Emma had written. "But sometimes when you laugh, it sounds like you're remembering how to do it instead of just doing it." Walsh folded the letter carefully, understanding that her daughter had identified something she could no longer perceive about herself. The boundary between her natural responses and programmed behaviors had become so blurred that she couldn't distinguish between genuine emotions and learned reactions. Corporal Danny Rodriguez stood at the altar of a small chapel in Ohio, exchanging vows with Maria in a ceremony that felt both profoundly meaningful and strangely artificial. Their words of love were genuine, but they spoke in synchronized rhythms that suggested their emotional connection had been partially programmed rather than naturally developed. Neither of them could remember what their relationship had felt like before the conditioning, but they had chosen to build something new from the fragments that remained. "Do you take Maria to be your wife?" the chaplain asked. "I do," Rodriguez replied, his voice carrying traces of Barrett's clinical precision even in this most human of moments. Maria's response matched his cadence perfectly, their words intertwining with mechanical harmony that was beautiful and deeply unsettling. In a secure psychiatric facility outside Seoul, the man who had once been Lieutenant Mark Barrett sat at a metal desk, methodically writing reports in handwriting so perfect it looked machine-generated. The counter-conditioning had worked beyond all expectations, turning him into a living psychological firewall that broadcast neutral behavioral patterns to everyone around him. But the process had been too successful. His original personality had been completely erased, replaced by programming so thorough that he no longer possessed individual thought. Barrett looked in the mirror each morning and saw a stranger wearing his face. His reflection showed no recognition, no spark of self-awareness, no connection to the person he had been before that August day when he went to trim a tree. The counter-conditioning had saved everyone else, but at the cost of turning him into something that was no longer entirely human. The psychiatric facility staff noted that Barrett never displayed emotional responses to stimuli that should have triggered human reactions. He ate, slept, and performed assigned tasks with mechanical efficiency, but he showed no preference for food, no dreams during sleep, and no satisfaction from completed work. He had become the perfect patient, completely compliant, utterly predictable, and psychologically stable in a way that was profoundly unnatural. Lee's final report on the Panmunjom incident concluded with a question that would haunt military psychologists for decades. If trauma can be artificially programmed into the human mind, and personality can be transmitted like a virus, what part of human consciousness truly belongs to the individual? When healing requires becoming someone new, are we saving the person or replacing them with an acceptable substitute? The Korean DMZ returned to its routine of perpetual tension, but the soldiers who guarded the line carried invisible scars from psychological warfare that had turned their own minds into battlefields. They functioned normally, performed their duties efficiently, and maintained the illusion of individual personality. But each of them knew that some essential part of their humanity had been permanently altered by forces beyond their understanding or control. The most terrifying truth was that the technique could be deployed again at any time, using any traumatized soldier as a transmission vector for psychological conditioning that could spread through civilian populations like wildfire. The human mind had proven to be the ultimate weapon and the ultimate vulnerability in wars that were fought with thoughts instead of bullets. In his final entry, Barrett wrote, "The experiment succeeded beyond all parameters. Subject compliance remains optimal. Individual identity markers have been permanently archived." He signed the report with mechanical precision, unaware that he was documenting his own psychological death. If Barrett's mechanical whispers have infected your thoughts, it's time to join the transmission. Check your handwriting. If it's looking a little too perfect, you know what's happening. Subscribe to the War Maestro archive to decode more classified psychological warfare files. Hit that notification bell, because some conditioning spreads faster than you think, and you'll want to be prepared when our next classified document surfaces. Share this story with fellow horror enthusiasts who understand that the most terrifying battles aren't fought with weapons, they're fought with minds. And remember to leave a comment below. Can you still tell the difference between your own thoughts and someone else's programming? Remember, some frequencies are still broadcasting.